"Would you keep one of them?" she asked. The words, barely a whisper, were nearly lost in the Arizona wind. The man she spoke to didn't move. He was a statue carved from dust and grief, his name Nuna, an Apache who had made solitude his only companion. He moved through the world like a ghost, leaving no tracks, wanting no part of it. But today the world had found him. The girl wasn't more than 10. Her dress was a patchwork of rags, her face smudged with dirt, but her eyes held the fire of a seasoned warrior. In her thin arms, she cradled two infants, tiny bundles wrapped in cloth that was almost as dusty as the ground they stood on. She didn't ask for money. She didn't beg for food. She offered a transaction, brutal and simple, an impossible choice. For a man who had cut every tie to the world, who had hollowed himself out to make room for silence, the question should have been meaningless. He should have turned his back. He should have walked away and let the cruel mercy of Silver Creek decide their fate. But he didn't. In the girl's defiance, he saw an echo of a strength he once knew. In the sleeping babies, a flicker of an innocence he thought was gone from the world forever. A phantom feeling stirred in his chest, the ghost of a tiny hand he once held, a memory from a life before the silence. He looked at the girl, Abigail Finch, though he didn't know her name yet. He looked at the two infants, Jonah and Levi, and he made a choice that went against every instinct for survival he had honed over a decade of running. He didn't choose one. He chose all of them. Without a word, he gave a slow, deliberate nod, a simple motion that sealed their fates together and set them all on a collision course with a past he could never outrun. He led them away from the harsh judgment of the main street, toward his small cabin tucked against the rocky hills. It was his sanctuary, a place where the world couldn't touch him. But the moment they stepped inside, the profound silence was shattered. The cries of hungry babies and the quiet, steady presence of a little girl filled the empty spaces of his life. Abigail, with a gravity far beyond her years, became his teacher. She showed him how to fold the makeshift diapers, how to test the goat's milk on his wrist, how to soothe a fever with cool cloths. The man who had forgotten how to care for anything, even himself, found a new purpose blooming in the barren landscape of his heart. He was a guardian. He was a protector. He had invited the world back in, and as he watched Abigail hum a lullaby to her brothers, he felt the first terrifying crack in the armor around his heart. The past was no longer a distant echo. It was a living, breathing thing in his home. And he knew with a chilling certainty that the peace he had mistaken for solitude was over forever. Something was coming for them. He could feel it on the wind. Days in Nuna's cabin were no longer measured by the sun's slow crawl across the sky. They were marked by the rhythms of the lives he now protected. Mornings meant warm milk and clean cloths. Afternoons were filled with the quiet sounds of Abigail mending old fabrics. Nights were for the soft, steady breathing of the two infants, Jonah and Levi, a sound that pushed back the ghosts that haunted his sleep. For the first time in 10 years, the silence wasn't empty. It was peaceful, a fragile, tentative peace, like the first wildflower pushing through cracked, dry earth. He found himself watching Abigail. Her small hands were surprisingly deft as she rocked a fussy Jonah. He saw the way she would instinctively check Levi's forehead for fever, a maternal gesture that was both beautiful and heartbreaking in a child so young. He, the silent observer, was learning a new language of soft sounds and gentle movements, a language he had long forgotten. His calloused hands, hands that could track a deer for days across stone and sand, learned the clumsy art of swaddling. His hunter's patience was repurposed to coax a crying baby to sleep. In these small moments, the shadows of his past seemed to recede, beaten back by the undeniable reality of the present. He was not just a man hiding from memory. He was a guardian. The thought was as grounding as it was terrifying. But in the West, news travels faster than a prairie fire, and the story of three white children living under the roof of a lone Apache was a spark in the tinderbox of Silver Creek. The town's prejudice was a low, simmering heat, always present, always waiting for fuel. That fuel arrived in the form of Sheriff Elias Thorne. Thorne was a man carved from the rigid timber of certainty. His world was black and white, civilized and savage, saved and damned. To him, the situation in the hills wasn't an act of compassion, it was a violation. a stain on the moral fabric of his town, an offense against God and the proper order of things. His heavy boots echoed a purposeful rhythm on the town's boardwalks. His voice, a low rumble of authority in the saloon and the general store, gathered the fears and suspicions of the townsfolk like a shepherd gathering a flock. Whispers turned to declarations. Concern, fanned by the sheriff's righteous fire, curdled into outrage. The Apache wasn't a savior, they murmured. He was a danger. The children weren't safe. They were captives. The first sign of the coming storm wasn't a shout. It was a shadow falling across the cabin's open doorway. Nuna looked up from the small wooden bird he was carving for Abigail. A figure on horseback sat silhouetted against the afternoon sun. It wasn't the sheriff. It was a prospector named Silas, a man who, like Nuna, lived on the fringes of things and understood the value of being invisible. Silas dismounted, his face a grim mask. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spoke of the talk in town, of the sheriff's sermons on purity and danger, of the posse that was being formed. His words were a simple, unadorned delivery of fact. But as he spoke, Nuna saw a flicker in the man's eyes, a quick glance toward the cabin where the sound of a waking baby could be heard. "It ain't just the sheriff stirring the pot," Silas admitted, his voice low. "It's Jedediah Kane." The name hung in the air like a bad smell. Kane was a rancher whose vast lands bordered Nuna's small plot, a man whose greed was as wide as the territory. He had long coveted the stream that ran through Nuna's land, the only reliable water source for miles. Kane was the loudest voice at the sheriff's side, painting Nuna not just as a savage, but as a squatter, a threat to property and decency. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The sheriff's righteous crusade wasn't just about prejudice. It was a cover for something far simpler and far uglier. It was about calculated greed. Fear was the weapon, and the children were the excuse. The threat wasn't a phantom anymore. It had a name and a face, and it wanted more than just the children. It wanted everything. After Silas rode off, a suffocating stillness fell over the cabin. Nuna's first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for a decade, screamed at him to run, pack what little they had, disappear into the mountains by sunrise, become a ghost again, swallowed by the canyons where no sheriff would dare to follow. It would be a hard life, but a safe one. He looked at Abigail. She had heard every word from the doorway, her small face pale, her hands clenched into tight fists. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw that same unbending resolve from the first day they met. She hadn't run from her fate. She had faced it. She had tried to bargain with it. How could he do any less? He looked down at the cradle he had built, at the two infants sleeping peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling in the innocent trust of the protected. To run was to teach them the world was a place to be hidden from. To stay, to fight, was to teach them that a home once found was worth defending. The choice was a chasm before him. On one side, the safety of the wilderness he knew so well. On the other, the fire and steel of a town that despised him, and the uncertain fate of the small family he had just begun to build. The air grew thick with the weight of his decision. The man who had spent a lifetime erasing his tracks now stood at a crossroads where the only path forward required him to stand up and be seen in all his unwelcome reality. He picked up the finished wooden bird and pressed it into Abigail's hand. Her small fingers closed around it, a silent acceptance. In that single moment, the battle inside him was over. He walked to the corner of the cabin, his movements calm and deliberate. He picked up his rifle. He checked the mechanism, not with the familiar ease of a hunter, but with the grim purpose of a protector. He would not run. He took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of pine and dust filling his lungs. For the first time in 10 years, he did not turn his back on the world of men. He walked toward it, but he wasn't just walking into a town. He was walking into a trap, and the man who set it had been waiting for a very long time. Walking into Silver Creek was like stepping into a different kind of wilderness. The threats here weren't rattlesnakes coiled in the shade or scorpions under a rock. They were in the eyes of the men who fell silent as he passed, in the way women clutched their children closer, shielding them as if from a plague. Every footstep on the dusty main street was an act of defiance. He had left Abigail and the twins in the cabin, promising to return by dusk. He carried nothing but the weight of the town's hatred, a burden heavier than any pack. He didn't look at the faces. He kept his gaze fixed on a small, weathered sign down the street. Dr. Alistair Reed, physician. It was an outpost of logic in a territory ruled by fear. It was his only hope. The doctor's office was an island of quiet order. The air smelled of carbolic soap and dried herbs, sterile and strange. Rows of glass bottles lined the shelves, their contents labeled with a precise, scholarly hand. Dr. Reed was older, with spectacles perched on his nose and a weariness in his eyes that spoke of seeing too much suffering. He looked up from his papers, his expression a careful mask of professional neutrality. No welcome, but no immediate hostility either. Just a cool, analytical curiosity. Nuna stood before the desk, his silence a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the town. He didn't speak of injustice or appeal to mercy. His words were few and deliberate, stripped down to the bone of truth. He spoke of a girl and two infants, orphans. He explained they were in his care, fed and sheltered. He stated, without emotion, that Sheriff Thorne intended to take them, to send them away to an institution where they would be separated, their small family broken forever. He wasn't asking the doctor to choose a side. He was asking him to be a witness, a man of science who could see a truth others refused to acknowledge. Dr. Reed listened without interruption, his fingers steepled. He had seen the worst of this land, not just the diseases that ravaged the body, but the hatreds that sickened the soul. He had treated men mauled by bears and men broken by prejudice, and he was no longer sure which was the more savage beast. He looked at the Apache before him, a man who carried himself with a profound, unshakable dignity, and saw not the monster the town described, but something else entirely. A man cornered by circumstance, fighting a tide of ignorance with the only weapon he had left, the simple, undeniable facts. As the doctor considered the request, his gaze fell on Nuna's hands. They were the hands of a man who lived with the land, calloused and capable. But there was something else, a fine dusting of yellow pollen on his sleeve. Reed recognized it instantly. Chamomile, an herb known for its ability to soothe a feverish child. It was a tiny detail, meaningless to anyone else. But for Alistair Reed, it was evidence. It spoke of care, of knowledge, of a tenderness that contradicted every rumor whispered in the saloon. The doctor had a past he rarely spoke of, a time back east where he'd witnessed men of supposed principle commit monstrous acts, using the law as a shield for their cruelty. He'd seen families destroyed in the name of order, a memory that left a permanent scar on his conscience. In Nuna, he saw an echo of that past, a chance to stand for the truth in a way he had failed to do before. This wasn't just professional anymore. It was personal. The silence stretched on. Finally, Dr. Reed removed his spectacles, cleaning them with a slow, methodical motion. He had made his decision. A medical report, the doctor said, his voice even, is a powerful thing, a testament to fact in a world drowning in opinion. I will come to your cabin at dawn. I will examine the children, and I will record my findings for anyone who cares to read them. Nuna gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. A sliver of relief pierced the tension. But the doctor wasn't finished. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. But you must understand, he continued, a piece of paper is not enough for men like Sheriff Thorne. He isn't interested in facts. He's interested in control. To fight that kind of fire, you need more than water. You need a voice they cannot ignore. He paused, letting the words settle. I will give you my report. I will stand by it. That is my promise. But it comes with a condition. The doctor's eyes were like steel. A report can be dismissed as the ramblings of an old doctor, but the truth spoken by the one who has lived it, that is a different kind of power. If I do this for you, you must do something for me. Nuna waited motionless. You will not hide them away. At the hearing, you will bring the girl, Abigail. You will stand beside her, and you will let her tell her story. The demand was a gut punch. To save his new family, he had to risk exposing its most vulnerable member to the very wolves he was trying to protect her from. It wasn't just a strategy, it was a profound test of faith, and Nuna had no idea if it was a test they could possibly pass. The first light of dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gray, spilling through the cabin window. There was a quiet order to the small space, a cleanliness born of Abigail's tireless efforts. The hearth was swept, water was heating, and the twins slept peacefully, wrapped in clean mended cloths. When Dr. Reed arrived, punctual as the sunrise, he found not the chaotic, squalid den the town's rumors had conjured, but a home, humble, rustic, yet filled with a palpable sense of care. Nuna greeted him with a nod. Abigail stood near the cradle, a small, fierce guardian, her eyes tracking the doctor's every move with a mixture of fear and suspicion. She didn't trust this man, or any man from the town that had taken everything from her. Dr. Reed set his black leather bag down and began to unpack his instruments. The metallic click of a stethoscope and the clink of glass vials were alien sounds in the quiet cabin. He began his examination with Levi, the healthier of the two. His hands were gentle, his eyes missing nothing. He checked the infant's weight, the clarity of his eyes, the rhythm of his breathing, making meticulous notes in a small ledger. He found a baby who was underweight, yes, but also alert, clean, and clearly nourished. There was no sign of the neglect the sheriff had so confidently predicted. Abigail watched, her fists clenched, but Nuna's calm presence seemed to soothe her. He stood like a mountain, a silent, unmovable force that promised safety. Then the doctor turned his attention to Jonah. The smaller twin had a persistent, wheezing cough that rattled his tiny frame. Dr. Reed's brow furrowed as he listened to the boy's chest. An inflammation of the lungs, he diagnosed quietly. Common enough, but dangerous in one so small. It can take them quickly. He reached into his bag for a dark bottle of syrup, a harsh remedy that often did as much harm as good. In that moment, Nuna moved. He didn't question the diagnosis. He simply held up a hand, a quiet request to pause. He slipped out of the cabin and returned moments later with a handful of silvery leaves and a piece of bark gathered from a resilient shrub that grew only in the high, rocky crags. He crushed them in a small stone bowl, his hands practiced and sure, releasing a sharp, clean scent of pine and mint. He added hot water from the hearth, letting the mixture steep until it turned a pale green. This was a knowledge passed down through generations, a science that had no need for glass bottles or Latin names. He soaked a clean strip of cloth in the warm infusion, wrung it out, and gently laid the steaming poultice on Jonah's chest. Then he lifted the infant, holding him close, and began to hum a low, monotonous chant, a sound that was less a song and more a vibration of healing and peace. There was no sudden miracle, but slowly, gradually, the harsh, ragged sound of Jonah's breathing began to soften. The frantic struggle in his small chest eased. The child's tense body relaxed against Nuna's shoulder. Dr. Reed watched, utterly captivated. His scientific curiosity had overridden his professional skepticism. He was witnessing a different kind of medicine, ancient, intuitive, and undeniably effective. A man of charts and chemicals, he was seeing healing in its most elemental form. The respect in his eyes, once tentative, became genuine and profound. He saw not a savage performing some ritual, but a knowledgeable man applying his craft with skill and compassion. Nuna had proven more than his ability to care for a child. He had demonstrated a wisdom the doctor's books did not contain. Reed quietly put his own bottle of syrup back in his bag, unused. He finished his notes, his handwriting now infused with a new conviction. The report would no longer be a simple statement of health. It would be a testament to the extraordinary care these children were receiving. A fragile sense of victory settled over the cabin. They had evidence. They had an ally. But the world outside had not changed. The quiet was shattered by the sudden thunder of approaching horses. Too many. Too fast. The door was thrust open before anyone could react, banging against the wall. Sheriff Elias Thorne stood silhouetted against the harsh morning light, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He was flanked by two deputies, their faces grim. His cold eyes swept over the scene. The doctor, the Apache holding the child, the girl standing defiantly before the cradle. He didn't wait for an explanation. His justice was swift, simple, and deaf to any evidence but his own prejudice. "The time for talk is over," he declared, his voice cutting through the air like a shard of glass. "Step aside, Apache. I'm here for the children." The trap had been sprung. The air in the cabin grew thin and cold, charged with the metallic taste of violence. Sheriff Thorne's presence filled the doorway, a solid block of righteous certainty casting a long, dark shadow. His deputies shifted their weight behind him, their hands near their holsters, their eyes fixed on the rigid set of their leader's shoulders. Dr. Reed held up his ledger like a shield. "Sheriff," he began, his voice strained but steady, "this man has done nothing wrong. These children are weak. My report states clearly they are receiving excellent care. To move them now would be irresponsible." Thorne let out a short, derisive laugh. "Your report?" he scoffed, taking a step into the room. "I don't need your ink-stained papers to tell me what's right. I see a savage with 3 white children. That's all the report I need." His gaze was a physical force, meant to intimidate. He dismissed the doctor with a wave of his hand and fixed his eyes on Nuna. "Give me the boy." Nuna didn't move. He held the sleeping Jonah a little closer, feeling the fragile warmth of the child's body. He knew any sudden movement, any word of defiance, would be met with overwhelming force. He couldn't win a fight of strength. The sheriff and his men were the law, and he was nothing, an outsider. But years in the wild had taught him things other men didn't know. He knew how to read the subtlest signs, the twitch of a deer's ear, the shift in the wind, the flicker of doubt in a man's eyes. And as he looked past the unyielding granite of the sheriff's face, he saw it. In the younger of the 2 deputies, a man named Miller whose wife had just had their first child, he saw a crack in the certainty. Miller's eyes kept darting towards the cradle. His jaw was tight with an unease that wasn't aggression. He was a follower, caught in the powerful current of another's will. It was to this man, not the sheriff, that Nuna finally spoke. His voice was low and calm, not a challenge, but a simple statement of fact. "The boy's fever has just broken," he said, his gaze locked on Deputy Miller. "The steam from the herbs on his chest helps him to breathe. The morning air is cold. To take him from the warmth of this cabin now." He let the sentence hang, allowing the man's own fears as a new father to complete it. He didn't speak of laws or rights, but of the fragile thread of a child's life, a language every parent understands. He saw the flicker of recognition in Miller's eyes, the slight involuntary recoil. The deputy's hand, which had been resting on his gun, now seemed uncertain. Dr. Reed, a keen observer himself, saw the opening. He seized it, turning his authoritative tone on the wavering deputy. "Deputy Miller," he said sharply, "you are an officer of the law, but you are also a witness. You have seen me, a licensed physician, treating this child. You have heard my medical opinion. If you assist in removing this infant against my direct medical advice and any harm should come to him, I will testify to that fact in a court of law. You will be as responsible for what happens as the sheriff." The threat was no longer abstract. It was personal and legal. The deputy's face went pale. He was a simple man who wanted only to do his job and go home to his family. He had been prepared for a confrontation with a savage, not a moral and legal entanglement with the town doctor. He looked from the doctor's determined face to Nuna's calm gaze, and then to the sleeping infant. He took a half step back, a small but seismic shift in the balance of power. The sheriff saw the retreat, his absolute authority beginning to fracture. His face flushed with fury. He couldn't force the issue without the unwavering support of his men. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. The standoff was broken, but Thorne was not a man to accept defeat. He pulled his anger in, reshaping it into a new weapon. He pointed a finger, not at Nuna, but at the doctor. "You've won this little trick, Doc," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "You and your savage friend. But this is not over." He backed out of the doorway, his eyes burning with a cold fire. "This won't be settled in the shadows. We'll bring this into the light. I'm taking this matter before Judge Harlan Pike. We'll have a formal hearing, and the whole town of Silver Creek will be there to see what justice really means." With that final vow, he turned and left. The immediate danger had passed, but in its place loomed a far larger threat. A battle to be fought not with guns, but with words and whispers, in a courtroom where their fate would be decided by the very prejudice they had just narrowly escaped. And Judge Pike was a man known for making examples of those who defied the town's order. In the days following the sheriff's forced retreat, a strange and fragile peace settled over the cabin. It wasn't the silence of solitude Nuna had once known, but a quiet humming with the new rhythms of a shared life. The threat of the hearing loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon, but for a few precious days they existed in the calm eye of that storm. A new routine, born of necessity and growing affection, took root. Nuna would rise before the sun, preparing the morning fire. He began to teach Abigail the secrets of his world, not with lectures but with quiet demonstrations. He showed her which roots were sweet and which were poison, how to read the story of the previous night in the tracks left in the dust, and how to know by the scent of the air when rain was coming. In return, Abigail brought her own world into his. She insisted on order, organizing his few belongings and mending his worn clothes with small, precise stitches. Their two lives, once so separate, began to weave together, creating a new pattern of reliance and unspoken understanding. Dr. Reed became a regular visitor, his professional duty transforming into a genuine alliance. He'd arrive on horseback, his saddlebags filled not only with medical supplies for the twins, but with parcels of flour, salted meat, and sometimes a piece of hard candy for Abigail. He saw what was growing in that small cabin, a family taking its first tentative breaths. One afternoon, he brought a thin, worn book of children's primers. "A mind needs nourishment as much as a body," he said to Nuna, his gaze resting on Abigail. Nuna simply nodded, and so a new ritual began. By the firelight in the evenings, Abigail would sit beside the doctor, her small finger tracing the strange shapes of letters, her brow furrowed in concentration as she sounded out her first words. Nuna would sit apart, carving or mending leather, but he listened to every sound, every small triumph as the girl began to unlock the mysteries of the written word. He was seeing the shape of a future for her, a future he had never dared to imagine. And the fierce protective instinct in his chest grew into a powerful, aching love. It was during one of these quiet evenings that she found it. Tucked away on a high ledge, covered in a fine layer of dust, was a small carved object. A wooden hawk, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The wood was dark and smooth, worn down by the touch of many hands. She brought it to Nuna, her curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. "What is this?" she asked softly. Nuna took the carving, his fingers closing around it with a familiarity that was both tender and painful. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken memories. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, dredged up from a place of deep sorrow. "It was for my son," he said, not looking at her, his eyes fixed on the fire. He was swift like the hawk. He saw everything. He offered no more, but Abigail understood. She had seen that same distant, hollowed look in the eyes of others in Silver Creek who had lost someone. Later that night, after Abigail was asleep, Dr. Reed spoke quietly to Nuna. "The fever that took your people, was it the burning sickness, the one that makes the lungs fill with water?" Nuna nodded, his face a stoic mask. The doctor's expression was grim. "It was the same influenza that swept through the mining camps a few months ago. It's what orphaned the Finch children." The revelation settled between them, profound and chilling. It was not random chance that had brought them together. They were all survivors of the same invisible war, their lives irrevocably shaped by the same wave of sickness and death. The bond between them was not one of circumstance, but of a shared tragic destiny. Nuna was not just rescuing three orphans. He was rebuilding a family from the ashes of the one he had lost. The feeling of belonging, of rightness, deepened, giving them a false sense of security. They were a clan bound by loss and loyalty, a small island of resilience. But the world had not forgotten them. The peace was shattered late one afternoon by a sharp official knock. It was Deputy Miller, alone this time. He stood on the threshold, holding his hat in his hands, his gaze fixed on the floor. There was no aggression in his demeanor, only a deep, weary shame. He held out a folded piece of paper. "From Judge Pike," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The official summons. The hearing is set for Friday next at the courthouse. He wouldn't meet Nuna's eyes. After a moment, he simply turned and walked away, a man doing a job he clearly no longer believed in. Nuna took the paper. It felt alien in his hand, cold and impersonal. The printed words, the official seal, symbols of a world that sought to impose its rigid, unfeeling logic on the fragile, beating heart of the family he had just begun to build. The calm was over. The storm had arrived, and it was far worse than he imagined, because the summons wasn't just for him. It listed another name, a name that made his blood run cold. Abigail Finch was not just being called as a witness. She was being named as a defendant, charged as a vagrant and ward of the state. Thorne wasn't just trying to take the children, he was trying to erase her completely. The day of the hearing arrived under a bleached, indifferent sky. The journey into Silver Creek was a silent procession through a gauntlet of hostile eyes. Nuna walked with a straight back, his gaze fixed forward. Beside him, Abigail matched his stride, her small face set with a determination that mirrored his own. Her hand was tucked tightly into his, a small anchor in a sea of animosity. Dr. Reed walked on her other side, a grim-faced guardian in a Sunday suit, his presence a clear declaration of his allegiance. They were an unlikely trio, a clan of three against an entire town. As they walked up the steps of the courthouse, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind them, it felt as if they were being swallowed whole. The courtroom was packed, a humming hive of suspicion and morbid curiosity. Every bench was filled. The air was thick and suffocating, smelling of sweat, dust, and cheap perfume. At the front, behind a massive oak bench, sat Judge Harlan Pike. He was a man whose reputation preceded him, known for a wisdom as unyielding as the surrounding mountains. His face was a landscape of deep lines, his eyes hooded and unreadable. He observed the room with an unnerving stillness, the absolute center of power in a room crackling with tension. Sheriff Thorne was the first to speak. He stood before the judge not as a lawman, but as a preacher at his pulpit. His voice boomed with righteous conviction, painting a vivid picture of imperiled innocence and savage influence. He spoke of the sacred duty to protect the children, to raise them in a civilized, God-fearing home. He twisted Nuna's quiet solitude into sinister secrecy, his knowledge of the wild into a dangerous pagan influence. He was conducting a symphony of fear, and the hushed, angry murmurs of the crowd were his orchestra. Then, to solidify his case, the sheriff called his star witness. "I call Mr. Jedediah Kane to the stand," he announced. Kane strode forward, dressed in his finest clothes, his face a mask of concerned citizenship. But beneath the performance, his eyes held the cold glint of avarice. Kane's testimony was a masterclass in calculated malice. He described Nuna not as a man, but as a trespasser, a squatter with no legal claim to the land or the water. He twisted Nuna's quiet life into a threat, inventing tales of strange chants heard on the wind at night, of eerie carvings left near his property line. He suggested Nuna's presence was a blight, a danger driving down the value of honest men's land. In that moment, the true nature of the conspiracy was laid bare. This was a partnership of greed and bigotry. The sheriff would get his moral victory, and Kane, his most influential supporter, would get the land and the water he had long coveted. Dr. Reed tried to object, to speak of medical facts and observable truths, but Judge Pike silenced him with a quiet raise of his hand. The facts of health and well-being seemed to hold no weight against the powerful testimony of fear and greed. When Kane finished, a triumphant smirk on his face, a heavy silence fell. The case against Nuna seemed absolute. Judge Pike looked down from his bench, his gaze finally settling on Nuna. The entire room held its breath. "You have heard the testimony presented against you." The judge's voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "The law provides you the opportunity to speak in your own defense. What do you have to say?" Nuna rose slowly to his feet, his movements deliberate, imbued with a dignity that stood in stark contrast to the venomous accusations. He didn't look at the judge or the hostile faces in the crowd. He looked down at the small girl sitting beside him. He saw the terror in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw that same core of unbendable steel. He made his choice. It was a sacrifice and a gamble, an act of ultimate faith. He placed a hand gently on Abigail's shoulder. Then he lifted his head and spoke to the judge, his voice clear and steady. "I have nothing to say for myself," he declared. "My words are wind. There is only one voice in this room that speaks the truth of this matter." He paused, letting the weight of his decision settle. "I ask the court to hear the testimony of Abigail Finch." A collective gasp went through the room. Sheriff Thorne shot to his feet, his face red with outrage. "Your Honor, this is a mockery. You can't let a child testify." But Judge Pike silenced him with a single sharp rap of his gavel. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "The witness has been called, Sheriff. She will be heard." His voice was low, but it carried an authority no one dared challenge. All eyes turned to Abigail. For a moment she seemed impossibly small in the imposing oak witness chair. She clutched the small carved hawk in her lap, her knuckles white. She looked at Nuna, and he gave her a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was all she needed, a promise, a shield. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice was not a whisper, but a clear, steady note that cut through the oppressive atmosphere. She didn't begin with accusations or defenses. She began with a story, her story. She spoke of the silence after the coughing sickness, the terrible hollow quiet in her small house. She spoke of the hunger that gnawed at her belly, and the even worse hunger she saw in the faces of her infant brothers. She described walking into Silver Creek, a town full of people who looked through her as if she were a ghost, their doors and their hearts closed. And then, her voice trembling for the first time, she spoke of the moment she stood before the tall, silent Apache, offering to trade one brother for the survival of the other. "I thought," she said, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall, "that if I could save one, it would be enough. That was the best I could do." The courtroom was utterly still. The hard-faced ranchers and their wives, the cynical prospectors, they were no longer watching a spectacle. They were listening to the confession of a child's heartbreak. Then her voice grew stronger. "But he didn't choose," she said, looking directly at the judge. "He took all of us." She described her life in the cabin, a tapestry of small, irrefutable truths. She spoke of how Nuna had taught her the names of the constellations, the warrior in the sky and the great bear, so she wouldn't be afraid of the dark. She told of the low, humming lullaby he would sing to the twins, a sound that could soothe any cry. She described with clinical precision how he had made the poultice for Jonah's chest, how the smell of the herbs had filled the cabin, and how the baby's ragged breathing had grown calm beneath his hands. "Dr. Reed has books and medicines," she stated simply, "and Nuna has the earth and the wind. Both of them make us safe." She held up the carved hawk. "He made this for me," she said, "so I would have something that was mine. He has never once raised his voice. He has never been anything but kind." She didn't use words like love or family. She didn't need to. She had dismantled the sheriff's monster, brick by brick, lie by lie, and replaced it with a portrait of a father. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. The hostility had dissolved, replaced by a profound, uncomfortable shame. Women dabbed at their eyes. Men who had nodded along with the sheriff's anger now stared at their own hands. Deputy Miller looked at the floor, his face a mask of regret. Jedediah Kane's greed, in the pure light of the child's testimony, now looked small and ugly. When Abigail finished, a deep silence held the room. It was no longer the silence of judgment, but of reflection. Judge Pike sat motionless for a long time, his hooded eyes scanning the faces of his town. He saw the truth of the girls' words reflected in their expressions. He looked at Sheriff Thorne, whose certainty had collapsed into sputtering indignation. He looked at Nuna, who had not moved, his faith in the child having been his only defense. Finally, the judge's gavel came down again, not with a crack, but with a soft, final thud. "The petition brought by Sheriff Thorne is denied," he declared, his voice resonating with the full weight of the law. A wave of relief, silent and profound, washed through Nuna, Dr. Reed, and Abigail. But the judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore, this court grants temporary guardianship of Abigail Finch, Jonah Finch, and Levi Finch to the man known as Nuna." It was a victory, absolute and stunning. But as murmurs broke out, the judge raised a hand for silence. This decision, however, is not without conditions, he stated, his stern gaze sweeping the room. The world is not a simple place. This court orders that the children are to receive a formal education, to be overseen by Dr. Reed. He will submit a report on their progress every 6 months. He then looked directly at the crowd, his voice hardening. And a final condition, one that falls upon all of you. This family is now under the protection of the law. Any act of prejudice, any word of threat, any whisper of malice directed at them will be considered a direct contempt of this court. They have earned their peace. It is now the duty of this town to see that they have it. The verdict was more than just a legal ruling. It was the beginning of a new chapter, written not in the shadow of fear, but in the steady light of acceptance. A year passed, marked by the deepening of roots. The seasons turned over the small cabin. Winter brought a blanket of snow that quieted the world, and the family of four drew close around the warmth of the hearth, a small, bright flame against the cold. Spring came with the rush of melting snow in the stream and the first green shoots in Abigail's new garden. Summer was long and golden, filled with the laughter of the twins, now sturdy toddlers, as they chased butterflies. Autumn painted the hillsides in hues of rust and gold, a time for gathering, for settling in for the long peace ahead. The cabin itself had changed. A new room had been added, built with timber Nuna had felled and shaped with his own hands. There was a proper porch now where Abigail would sit in the evenings, no longer sounding out simple words, but reading stories aloud from books Dr. Reed brought her, her voice clear and confident. The town of Silver Creek had changed, too. The judge's final condition had hung in the air like a promise and a threat. The open hostility faded into a weary distance, which in turn softened into a quiet, curious respect. People who once crossed the street to avoid Nuna now offered a hesitant nod of greeting. Deputy Miller would sometimes ride out, not on official business, but with a sack of grain or a bolt of cloth, his actions a silent, ongoing apology. They saw him not as a savage, but as a father. They saw the Finch children not as captives, but as children who were healthy, happy, and deeply loved. They were a living testament to a truth the town had been forced to witness, that a home is built from the timbers of devotion, not the customs of one's ancestors. One day, following the advice of Judge Pike and Dr. Reed, Nuna went to the territorial office to file a formal homestead claim on the land he had cultivated. It was a final, crucial step to protect his family's future, to give them a place in the world that was legally and truly theirs. Judge Pike himself was there, unrolling an old, brittle surveyor's map of the territory, a document drawn by the first explorers. As he traced the boundaries of Nuna's claim, the stream, the rocky hills, the stand of cottonwood trees, his finger paused over a faded, elegant script near the source of the stream. The ink was faint, written in Old Spanish. "Do you know what this says?" the judge asked, his voice quiet with a strange reverence. Nuna shook his head. The judge translated, "Santuario del Pueblo Silencioso." He looked up at Nuna. "Sanctuary of the Silent Mountain People." It was the name the Spanish gave your ancestors, the Chiricahua Apache, who considered this very ground to be a sacred place of healing and refuge. In that single moment, the entire story of Nuna's life was rewritten. His decade of aimless wandering, his choice to settle in this specific, secluded spot, it had not been an accident. It was not an escape from his past, but a subconscious pilgrimage back to it. He had been drawn by an ancestral memory he didn't even know he possessed, to the one place on earth his spirit could truly be at home. He had not found a refuge. He had returned to one. And so, a man who had lost his tribe found it again, not in a gathering of people, but in the soil beneath his feet and the family he now held in his arms. A girl who had lost her home found that home is not a building, but the unshakable promise of belonging. And a town that had been blinded by prejudice was given the chance to see that the most courageous acts are not found in the heat of battle, but in the quiet, daily tending of a life, in the gentle soothing of a child, and in the steadfast protection of a promise. In the vast and unforgiving landscapes of the West, the greatest wilderness was not the land itself, but the uncharted territory of the human heart. And the surest guide through that wilderness was not a map, but the simple, unwavering light of love. A truth written not in law books, but on the enduring face of the earth itself. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us what part of the world you're watching this story from. Leave your comment, and to make sure you don't miss our next adventure, be sure to subscribe to the channel.